Thank you, Chris, for organizing. I'm also really excited. Thank you to everyone who joined today. It's really exciting to see people being interested in groundstone. So I'm excited to share some of my research on specifically groundstone gorgets with you tonight. And I'm also hoping we can discuss them a bit further after my presentation. So today I'm presenting from Toronto, um, which is also where all the gorgets are currently housed. All the gorgets that I'm sharing with you tonight, all the ones that I've studied at the Royal Ontario Museum. So I think it's important to note that Toronto is on the ancestral lands of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabe Nation, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, since time immemorial to today. But having acknowledged this, I think it's also important to mention that the gorgets I will be telling you about, are from all over Southern Ontario. So they are related to many more First Nations, and I'm hoping that through my work I can help reestablish some of these connections. So in this talk tonight, I am presenting some insights that I acquired while studying an assemblage of groundstone gorgets from the ROM's Archaeology of the Americas collection. And I'm combining technological and usewear analysis with museum catalog entries to reconsider the temporal and functional attribution of this broadly understudied object category. So this approach, I think, also brings forward their varied and continued histories as Indigenous belongings, as well as their complicated post-contact trajectories as antiquarian collectibles and as museum objects. So overall, by revisiting these often decontextualized gorgets and their ongoing relations through the lens of object history, it helps find new avenues for making legacy collections more accessible and, importantly, making them more meaningful in the present. So, so what are gorgets? Anyways, so they are often defined as these tabular groundstone objects, but overall, the term gorget and these objects in general remain very enigmatic and understudied. So we don't know a lot about them. They were found over a large geographic area that stretches from the Midwest of the United States up to Southern Ontario and Eastern North America. So the green area that I highlighted on this map, I think could even be more expanded to cover everywhere where groundstone gorgets are found in North America. The earliest ones that we know of that were found in good or dated archaeological contexts come from glacial cave context. So they're dated to around 3,000 years before present or 1,000 before the Common Era. So that corresponds to the transitional period between the late Archaic and the early woodland period. But through some of my analysis, I've come to believe that they most likely persist into contact. Um, However, so we have some that are dated in archaeological context, but because they were so popular amongst antiquarians from the late 19th to mid 20th century, gorgets often lack proper archaeological context. And that rarely includes more than broad find spots and a name of a collector. And find spots can be limited to a county, for example. So this is some context, but it's usually not what archaeologists are typically looking for. We like to get a little more to work with. But still, I think I can my through my approach, I'm able to say a little more, even though we're lacking a lot of context. So the name Gorget in itself is a bit controversial, as well. It's kind of a catch-all name that homogenizes what are actually very diverse objects. So very soon, antiquarians that were dealing with objects like gorgets or birdstones, banner stones, um, they came to give them all the name problematical, which I translate to we don't know what these are. Let's move on and focus on something else. Um, but according to Cumberland and to many others, gorgets are flat stones of elongated form that taper towards the end, that are rounded at the edges, and pierce with 1 to 3 holes. And he suggests that they were worn as personal decorations. And he also mentions that they were in the what he calls the Stone period, the progenitors of the silver Warasis. So these silver, brass, and even sometimes ceramic gorgets of the Euro-colonial period were modeled after French and English military insignia. Sorry, okay. Some things are popping up on my screen. And so the ones that you're seeing in the row above, these types of gorgets were often gifted to Indigenous chiefs and officers who would ally with the French and English. But are they really the same thing? Or as Squire and Davis suggests, is gorget just used for lack of a better term? So I don't have an actual better term to propose, but I think just by looking at how they might be different from one another, at least shows that they're multiple and they're not just this one thing that eventually is made from these European materials. So, one of the most exhaustive texts that was written about gorgets was by Peabody and Moorhead. So it's a relatively old document from the very early 20th century. And Peabody and Moorhead were really trying to make sense of a bunch of gorgets that they had the chance to work with. And they tried to create somewhat of a typology for gorgets, which is tends to be based on very subjective descriptions of shape. Um, so I'm currently working on a typology of gorgets. I'm not going to share it with you today because it's not complete at the moment, but I'm trying to find ways of describing them that is less subjective, so more of a taxonomic tree that everyone can use and that is more straightforward. And hopefully that can help us make sense of their overall their difference, their morphological differences, and if that might connect with functions. So speaking of functions, Peabody and Moorhead were also really much interested, as were many people at the time, interested in figuring out what these objects were for. So as you can see here, they had many ideas, thinking of them as adornments or as things that are connected with the dress, spindle whorls, weights. So I'm not going to name all of them, but you can see they're really trying to figure out every single potential function that these objects might have had. So there's very few in terms of actual ethno-historical mentions for gorgets that could help corroborate any of these potential functions. We have one by Parker who observed amongst the Seneca a hair ornament that resembled a gorget. Turner witnessed amongst the Inuit some boards that were rolled up, on which the women would wrap their hair. But those were made of wood. But interestingly, both have, I find, resemble in some way what we know as meadowwood gorgets. But that's pretty much all I found in terms of ethnohistorical testimonies. And soon, people who are interested in gorgets are more uh, the collectors. So the information we get about them is more anecdotal, we could say. It's not so much about um, associating them to a type or describing them. It's more these single finds that are described in relics collectors' journals. Yep. So during my Rebank's postdoctoral fellowship at the Royal Ontario Museum, I got the chance to study many of the objects from the very broad legacy collection, including the huge collection of groundstone gorgets. So I looked at around 677. There might be a little more that are not included in that number. And I was able to differentiate some preforms, many complete gorgets, some that were broken, and some that were just gorget fragments. But I had very limited provenience. So my question, or what I was interested in figuring out, was how I could I help reconstruct their histories, even though they didn't have that much context. So I was interested in, and I still am interested in their histories as collectibles and as museum collections, but also their persistent histories as indigenous belongings. So if we think about them from a technological perspective or the chaîne opératoire perspective, how can we figure out how they circulated from source to being manufactured? How were they used? How were they reused, reshaped, or repurposed? Um, and could we even try to reconstruct some part of their depositional context based on the traces that are present on their surface? As I mentioned, I'm working on constructing a typology that can easily be used and that might help us make sense of these belongings. But I also conducted some usewear analysis to document their diverse histories and kind of challenge this one object category. So try to see how they're differentiated from one another. And importantly, I wanted to make them accessible to their Indigenous relatives by putting together all existing information, constructing maps linked to their find spot, and posting on the Royal Ontario Museum's digital platform. So overall, getting them out of the collection's drawers and into the world, and better understanding where their differences and similarities are situated, so we can have more nuanced stories that can be told about these highly varied objects. So I compiled the geographic data associated with each gorget, excluding, unfortunately, a few that have absolutely nothing in terms of find spot. So in some cases, I have more precise information, such as the name of a town, or even the lot and concession. But for the sake of consistency, I distributed them according to the county in which they were found. So there's, as you can see, close to nothing around Toronto, which is likely due to the extent of development. But spatial distributions show that there's a major concentration in what is now known as Middlesex County and the surroundings, and Prince Edward County. So this is where the gorgets were found, or where we think they were found when before they got to the ROM. But how did they actually get there? So I created this graph to see when the Gorgets were acquired, how that could inform us about the historical context surrounding their acquisition. So in the 80s, so late 19th century, David Boyle, which was Ontario's first professional archaeologist, curator, and also a self-appointed steward of Indigenous traditions, started acquiring many gorgets from farmers, from collectors, and from Indigenous collaborators. So as you can see in this graph, the major waves of gorget acquisition really follow shortly the Indian Act of 1876. So with the subjectification of Indigenous people through the Indian Act, we have the increased impacts of dispersals, forced assimilation, dispossession. So Indigenous people were often pressured to trade or to sell their traditional belongings at that time. Um, so I'm not showing you a list of the donors, but there are over 120 donors for these 667 gorgets. So some of the one that has that contributed the most is a certain J.W. Stewart with 116 gorgets. Then we have G.J. Chad, William Murray, and William Mason. And in some cases, there are bits of information about these people, but if you know anything about who these men were, I am very interested in learning more about them. So there are also a few Indigenous collaborators who helped Boyle acquire artifacts, including some gorgets. And one of these collaborators is Chief Alexander General Smith, also known as Dekanen Rane. So he is a Kanyen Kehaka man who collaborated with David Boyle, and he donated cultural belongings to museums, to historical societies, and would have seen this as a way of solidifying these institutions' political support of Indigenous sovereignty. So Indigenous collectors like Smith also displayed their collections at agricultural, provincial, and world fairs and exhibits, such as the World Exposition in Chicago in 1893. And they did so to raise awareness to the vitality of their cultures. So Smith, from just based on the gorges themselves, I think he also donated or other artifacts, but 10 gorgets in the collection are from him. All appeared to have been collected from Tuscarora Township in County, and all were donated in 1892. The chaîne opératoire, we have this focus on manufacture and technology, but we also consider traces that speak about use, discard context, and recycling. So these are some examples of some of the stages in the history of a gorget. So you have a blank to the left where you can see the scars from the work around the edge, the shaping around the edge. They're actually bifacial. You can also see there's a lot of pecking marks on the surface, which in my opinion, contrasts with the identification of most gorgets as being made of slate. Because if you're working with slate, you have very nice flat surfaces, so there is absolutely no need to be pecking them into shape. So we're not going to get into materials today, but I don't think many of them are actually made of slate. And then there are a couple pieces that have incomplete. Some of them will show finishing traces, such as the third one from the left, which I really like because we can actually see that that one was finished using a steel file. And the one on the extreme right is a gorget that was reshaped. So top end was ground um, to smoothen the fracture, and you can see the a perforation that was there that probably is where the gorget broke. So I considered these traces of manufacture and recycling. Sorry. Okay. But also conducted some usewear analysis. So for all pretty much I think I looked at all 600 and a little more of them. So I looked at how the scars, the striations, pit polish, the residue, all of these things were distributed and how they were characterized on every single of these gorgets to be able to trace connections between distribution of polish around striations or even traces of striations from attachment. So you can see some of them are, I was able to observe some linear traces likely from when they were attached to something. This is maybe not the best example, but in some cases we'll see that one face is has an extremely developed polish, while the other one doesn't, which suggests that they were tightly attached to a surface. And there are a couple that are visible in some of these drawings. At bottom left, you can see someone engraved possibly initials at the surface. But in other cases, using a microscope allowed me to see some engravings that would not be visible otherwise. And it also helped me realize that gorgets really did have multiple functions, including as pendants, but also possibly as some forms of buttons, of cutting or scraping tools, and even potentially as so. In the catalog and notes of the Orania historical collection that was written by Gorgets, it is suggested that these stones have been also used, may also have been used as tools or knives, and that means had been used as ceremonial gorgets. So I had been seeing a lot of gorgets that actually did show beveled edges. So some of them have beveled edges that show absolutely nowhere. It's more it's just seems to be part of the design. But in some cases, the edges are seem to have been added subsequently, and there is some well-developed wear on this. And I had to choose which one I wanted to show everything, so I chose those that are maybe the more visible based on the pictures I have. But we can see that there is some really well-developed luster on some of these edges. Some very, very small, I don't know if you can see some very small striations, especially on the one to the left, that are perpendicular to the edge, which a movement perpendicular to that edge. And this very well-developed polish is something that is also found on stones that are used burnishing stones on ceramics. So they would have been used in that motion, which would create some of these perpendicular striations that we're actually seeing on some of these gorgets. So is that what they were really used for? I can't say for sure, but there's definitely some connections between these striations that we're seeing, and especially the development of polish that is found on burnishing stones. So we have these gorgets that have these well-developed lateral edges. In some cases, they'll be even concave, so they're really, really developed. Other gorgets that also appear to have been used as tools have these edges that are distal edges that have been ground into shape. So again, in many cases, it seems to be an afterthought, possibly a secondary use as was suggested. And in some cases, these edges are clearly ground using metal files. So that's visible on the one to the left. We can see multiple facets from grinding the edge and regrinding it. And it seems like it was used on a hard surface based on the presence of these little scars along the edge. The one in the center also shows these perpendicular striations that are perpendicular to the edge with possibly some residue in there, but definitely these edges were used to work some sort of hard material or material that had some grit in it for these striations to develop. And the one on the right is another one that I find really interesting because not only was it sharpened on the edge, this kind of very shiny polish is something that I have observed to be developed on tools that are used to work charred wood. And this is also one of the gorgets that was donated by Alexander Smith. So David Boyle's Indigenous collaborator. And this citation, this little quote by Michelle Hamilton in oh now I'm blanking on the name of Collections and Objections. She mentions that an owner of a slaughterhouse in the Georgian Bay used skinning stones rather than knives in his daily work, which suggests that some of these gorgets might have been found by farmers, or here we have an owner of a slaughterhouse and repurposed and reshaped. And that might explain why we see a lot of them having these metal traces of metal file on their edge. Although with the one on the right, we also have to take into consideration that Indigenous people that are still here and that continued to be present as these steel files were becoming available could have also repurposed some of these gorgets for their own needs. So another potential function that I observed, so I started to realize that a lot of the gorgets that I was seeing had these deep notches on their sides, and oftentimes these long grooves were kind of rounded and located on stones that were seem to have a bit more of a silica contact. So what we're seeing here, the two on the right are some silicified mudstones, so stones that are harder than the more common Huronian slate, what is referred to as Huronian slate that is common for many gorgets. So we have these distinctive chipped edges from what I suspect is repetitive use with a steel strikolite. And the typical traces that are usually produced when a strikolite is used. So we have edge rounding, battering, and crushing that can be seen macroscopically, but also microscopically. And we also have on many of these long grooves that you can see at the top right that suggest a complementary use as a whetstone for some of these gorgets. So these traces project gorgets, in my opinion, well into the Euro-colonial period. So it's becoming more and more difficult to think of them as being not around or not used anymore, starting around 900 of the Common Era. So I had a little video here. The sound doesn't seem to be working, so I'll just turn it off in case. And I put the link in the chat if you want to listen. Um, but based on some of the traces that I was seeing on a lot of them, I also got interested in trying to see if any of these might have been used as bull roarers. So there are a couple articles out there of people who have conducted experiments on objects that look a lot like gorgets, in my opinion. Some of them, so on the left here, you're seeing things that people have described as potential pendants. There's a lot of those in the ROM's collection, but on the right, you can also see some that actually have two perforations. So those are from South Africa, but gorget-like implements used as bull roarers or aerial phones are common throughout the world. And there's an article by Jay Custer, who's a prof at University of Delaware, who conducted some experiments and found that pretty much any gorget will create the sound that I was hoping I could share with you. So it makes a kind of buzzing sound. Um, and he also collected some information about the occurrence of these types of implements in the Northeast across the world, but in the Northeast, he found that in the Eastern Subarctic, Algonquins, Eastern Cree, the Naskapi, the Ojibwe, these kinds of bull roarers were used. And they could have been used for weather magic, to reproduce or to create the sounds of spirits in initiation rites, as protective amulets, or as tokens of spiritual vision experiences or spiritual patronage. So how could we actually know if these if the gorgets in the collection are actually just pendants, or if they are bull roarers? So the main way, so experiments show that it actually works. So what these experimenters found was that there's a clear difference in the distribution of polish around perforations with gorgets or implements that were used as bull roarers, or how they call it here, spinning discs. So I put an image of a relatively unworn perforation to the left so we can compare. The one in the center is rounded, well-rounded all around the edges, or almost. And it contrasts with the pendant on the right, where we can see that the perforation is worn only in the superior portion at the top here. Um, yeah, so I suspect some of these gorgets, especially the ones with a perforation in the very center like that, which wouldn't make a lot of sense as pendants, might have been actually used as bull roarers. I also suspect that these gorgets that we call pendants were not necessarily pendants, maybe more something akin to whetstones, and eventually, in some cases, when it's possible, as fire flints. Um, but they do oftentimes show an attachment that creates this kind of trace only in the superior portion of the tool, or of the object. So there are multiple potential uses beyond ornament, and already we're starting to see that there are many different ways a gorget could have been used, or could have been shaped, and the traces would be reflective of these different uses. So I think those that to me appear to be the most convincingly related to an ornamental function are those that have been reshaped or recycled from fragmented gorgets. So in some cases, we'll see some smoothened fractures, um, and some new perforations, which tend to be narrower than the ones that we see on non-fragmented or non-recycled gorgets. Oftentimes, I've seen some coiled perforations, which suggest potentially the use of modern drills. And they also are the ones that have the clearest traces of suspension. And one that I added, the last one on the right, I found was really interesting because it's actually not retouched at all, but you can't see it here, but there is a clear striation that shows that it was suspended just as is. So important objects that will persist into their history, even as they eventually break. So I mentioned that I wanted to make gorgets from the ROM's legacy collection more accessible. So I uploaded close to 600 gorgets, their images on the ROM's e-museum. So they're only so far accompanied, most of them are only accompanied by very preliminary descriptions, but at least they're there. And they're there with the area where they were found. So people who are interested in knowing which ones are in their area can access them. And you have the link if you haven't been explored the ROM's e-museum. If you type Gorget in search bar, you'll see there are 51 pages of Gorget images. Some are oriented in a weird way. We had some issues there with TMS, but they're there, so you can also start exploring these objects if you're interested. Another example of how some of these are reaching beyond the walls of the ROM. One of these examples is the Malden Gorget. Some of you might have heard about it before. It's a constricted center gorget with some crescent-shaped ends, and it's made of cannel coal. And similar gorgets have been found in contexts that are attributed to the early woodland glacial cave burial complex. So again, around 3,000 years before present or 1000 BCE. And those are very rare because they're made of cannel coal. And cannel coal, as its name suggests, is a bituminous coal whose sources are found across Appalachia, but it's a flammable material. So very few of these are still around today. So I got a chance to describe this, analyze it, and write a little report and see how you can see the notches on that one end. There are some very cool incisions on both ends. And interestingly, even though we tend to think of gorgets as being found in burial contexts, which they often are, this one there was no I don't think there was any other objects or anything associated with it. So it doesn't seem to be from one of those contexts. But it does show that it had an extended history, an extended life through these repair holes that we're seeing on both ends of that fracture. It was found in Windsor, Essex, near the North Shore of Lake Erie in southwestern Ontario. And the Caldwell First Nations traditional territory is rooted in the area. So recently, Caldwell First Nation and the ROM partnered to share this belonging at the CFN Unity Day exhibit, What Belongs to Us. So I'm looking forward to more similar connections. Hopefully the e-museum can help generate these connections, but people knowing what is out there from their traditional territories. Um, and another project, another collaborative project that involves gorgets was for an exhibit by Alexis Gros-Louis. So Alexis is a multidisciplinary artist from Wendake. He's also liaison officer for le Bureau d'Union NCO. And he's an artist who explores the paradox of contemporary Indigenous life and culture, drawing on post-colonial theories, critical epistemology, and new archaeological research to challenge the erasure and replacement of memory and heritage of First Nations. And he does that by questioning the infrastructures and authority of political, social, and cultural institutions. So Alexi spent some time at the ROM in preparation for an exhibit that took place in Montreal in the spring of 2024. So he was interested in the role that new technologies can play in regenerative actions. And he 3D scanned multiple gorgets. I'm not sure if I can make it work. No, it worked. It, it it's not working here. I could actually move it around. I was hoping I could show you that, but you can imagine that you can swirl around, which I think is also another great way of making Indigenous belongings accessible virtually. They can be manipulated, they can be 3D printed, and people can interact with them more easily that way. So with these scans, he created 3D replicas of plaster and resin, which he painted purple and nailed to a wall as a nod to some of the crude mounting practices of collectors and museums. And this allowed to bring these belongings into the present, and to allow Gorgets to interact with new materials and new technologies. So another good example of how these objects can inform us about their multiple histories, but how can they um, get continue their existence beyond the walls of a museum. So even though the belongings we have come to know as gorgets often lack good context, I think there is still a lot of potential which could also be applied to other objects. I've done similar work with birdstones. I'm also interested in doing the same for many of those other objects that are in legacy collections and that unfortunately don't have a lot of context. So this is that's it for my presentation. Thank you to everyone who helped with this project. Thanks to the London chapter of the OAS, and I think we can have a few minutes to talk.